My name's Kathryn McCabe. I, as Tony said, am a postdoc in the 22q lab. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm from Australia. I was a postdoc working with Dr. Linda Campbell in her Family Interaction Neurodevelopmental Disorders group, and was lucky enough to secure an ARTP, so Autism Research Training Program Fellowship, to come here and work with Tony and Kathy at the Mind Institute for 2 years. So I'll be presenting to you today some preliminary findings from a study that I've been working on in my time here, exploring the social phenotype in children with 22q and idiopathic autism spectrum disorder. So basically, in terms of what I'll be covering today, I'll be looking at social impairment in 22q, and then I'll be describing to you the social phenotype study, so the methodology that we've used for the study, and then the preliminary data. I won't go through all of it, and that will become clear to you soon why I'm not going through all of it. We've collected a lot of data in this study, but I'll provide some of the preliminary findings that we have so far. So as Kathy's already covered, in terms of the psychiatric profile that we see in 22q, first things first, it's highly variable, and 22q in and of itself is a highly variable genetic syndrome with over 180 clinical features. We see increased rates of a range of psychiatric conditions, and this figure here is from Carrie Bearden's group at UCLA. And I think it summarises quite nicely the different course of psychiatric disorders that can emerge over development. Kathy's already noted rates of anxiety that we see in 22q. We know that there's increased rates of schizophrenia and psychosis more broadly compared to the general population, as well as mood disorders peaking in adolescence. But I want to focus today on the disorders that emerge in childhood, and I'll be focusing on autism spectrum disorders in particular. But I think the figure here is, I've included it to demonstrate that emotional, behavioural and social difficulties are reported in 22q across the lifespan. However, examination into the behavioural and psychiatric profile of individuals with 22q has yielded mixed results in the literature, and especially so in the case of autism spectrum disorder. So I have this table here from a paper that was published by the International 22q Consortium, and it's pulled data from multiple sites to look at rates of different psychiatric conditions across the lifespan. And whereas Carrie Bearden's group, the paper they published, estimated rates of about 50% of ASD, the data pulled from this study reported rates of about 13% in children aged 6 to 12. And recent meta-analysis that looked at rates of ASD across a range of genetic syndromes and actually weighted the studies based on the methods that they used to collect that information, estimated rates of about 11% of autism spectrum disorder in 22q. So rates reported in the literature have been quite variable. Kathy and Tony completed a study using gold standard assessment of ASD and found that none of the 29 participants met their criteria for autism spectrum disorders. Others have reported rates of up to, I think 80% was one of the studies included in this one, using parent report alone. So I should say that for those of you not familiar with autism spectrum disorder, it involves difficulties in areas of social reciprocity and communication, and also includes unusual, restricted and repetitive behaviours. It's a disorder that usually begins in infancy and usually diagnosed in the first 3 years of life, and current estimates suggest that 1 in about 68 children are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So now, in terms of the neurocognitive profile that we see in 22q, it's a broad profile of cognitive challenges and strengths. In infancy, motor delays are common and can often include hypertonia. Speech and language difficulties are common. onset of language is often delayed, and during preschool and primary school, learning difficulties are also common. In terms of intellectual functioning, IQ is typically in the borderline range, and 1/3 of individuals show mild to moderate intellectual disability. Speech and language difficulties and social communication difficulties are common, as well as difficulties in the areas of visual spatial processing, which I think Tom will cover in more detail a little bit later on, arithmetic, language functions, attention, working memory, and then strengths are often indicated in areas of verbal ability, rote processing, verbal memory, reading and spelling. And then when we look at social cognition difficulties that we see in 22q, the data in that domain is also fairly mixed. We see poorer performance on measures of effect recognition compared to typically developing peers, poor performance on measures of mentalising and false belief, so that's in the domain of theory of mind. So that's understanding that the thoughts and intentions of others can be different from our own. Although, as I mentioned, the findings in this area can be quite variable. I've found from my own work that when I take into account statistically difficulties with language, so understanding contextual information, or take into account some of the executive difficulties that we see in 22q, that the group differences don't hold on measures of social cognition. But we do know that individuals with 22q have difficulties with social functioning. So one of the aims of this study was to really try and tease apart and understand what are these difficulties that are leading to elevated rates of autism diagnosis and also impairing social functioning. So in the literature, I was reading this paper recently, and the description that the author used really captured my attention. And they say that parents of children with 22q are often concerned with their child's inability to use contextual information to understand and express information, inappropriate information transfer, including vague word choice, and irrelevant elaborations during conversation, and also problems understanding the implicit meaning of words. So in the lab, we often talk about it as difficulty understanding the content and intent of language. And so based on our experience with children with 22q and what we have gauged from the literature, it's our contention that children with 22q and those with idiopathic autism spectrum disorder have distinct neurobehavioural disorders, that despite similar social and communication symptom profiles, these arise from different etiologies and produce different impairments. So to look into this further, the aim of our study was to generate comparative perceptual, cognitive, linguistic, behavioural and emotional intermediate phenotypes for children with 22q or idiopathic autism spectrum disorder to explain the causes of each group's social impairment. We expected that children with autism or 22q will exhibit measurably distinct intermediate phenotypes despite similar level of intellectual functioning and significant social challenges in each group. So to do this, we selected a series of measures and parental report measures in domains that we thought were likely to impact social functioning. So we included parent reports of adaptive functioning, anxiety, social communication, as well as a clinician-blinded assessment of autism symptoms. So that's the ADOS right here, and I'll be discussing that in more detail. We're also looking at linguistic and conceptual abilities by looking at expressive and receptive language, aspects of vocabulary, so items from the WISC measure of IQ, and then comprehension of instructions, so responding to a verbally recited instructions from the clinician, and so in this case it's pointing to things in certain order based on the instruction that the child's been given. A child communication checklist that is a parent report that taps into use of expressive gestures, pragmatic language abilities, and really sort of captures a broad range of language ability during development, as well as the test of word knowledge, figurative language use. So understanding what the coast is clear means. Next, we're also looking at social perception, so affect recognition. I'll be discussing that in more detail, as well as memory for faces. And then in terms of our theory of mind and social inference measures, we're looking at mentalising abilities and gesture recognition. So understanding the difference between intentions to communicate with non-verbal communication and just incidental gestures. So me tucking my hair behind my ear or scratching my neck, I'm not communicating anything. They're just incidental gestures compared to giving you a wave or looking at my watch. So I'll be discussing those in more detail. Then we've also measured executive functioning and attention. And well, I wouldn't expect differences in our groups on these measures. I think they are important to account for. So auditory attention, so remaining vigilant and listening to recordings and attending to a word. So you're waiting to hear the colour red, and it's maintaining your attention for a couple of minutes. So it's that vigilance abilities, inhibition, and then animal sorting. So there are 3 measures of executive functioning and attention that we're using. And then finally, we're also tapping into basic perceptual processing, so visual perceptual processing, looking at contour integration and contrast sensitivity. So we've really tried to look across a spectrum of domains that are likely to impact in different ways someone's ability to move through the world and interact with other people. So this is preliminary data. We're still recruiting for the study. We're recruiting children with 22q as well as children with idiopathic autism spectrum disorder aged between 6 and 12 years old. So far we have 17 kids with 22q and 14 with idiopathic ASD, and a mean age of 9 years old, and the sample itself at the moment is quite well matched. We've got an average age of 9 in both groups. Gender distribution is similar, though we have some more boys in the ASD group, and the sample is well matched on IQ with virtually the same IQ, mean IQ between our groups. So to start with, I mentioned the blinded clinical assessment of autism. So we've got 3 measures that we're using to look at autism symptoms in our groups. So to start with, we were splitting our 22q group in terms of parent-reported difficulties with reciprocal social communication. So we set a threshold of 60, and so that's an indication of the child having mild difficulties with reciprocal social communication. And 11 of our children were above 60 in this domain, so above threshold on this measure. And then we also measured social communication with the social communication questionnaire and set a lower threshold of 11. So 6 of our 17 children had a score above 11. And then our ADOS, which is an observational measure. So with autism spectrum disorder, gold standard assessment includes parental report, so parental history, as well as observation. So the ADOS was a clinician blinded assessment, so they knew the participant's age and their name. And they, in our sample of 17 participants, 8 of our kids were above threshold on the ADOS. So of those, first of all, 3 children, so 8 minus 5, had elevated ADOS scores, but below threshold SRS scores. So we decided in later analysis to just include all of our 22q participants together. But 5 of our kids had elevated scores on both the SRS and the ADOS, and 4 had elevated scores on all 3. Of those, we then included a clinician best estimate. And that's where the clinician uses the information from the SEQ and the information that they've gained from the ADOS, and they make a best estimate of what they think the child's primary diagnosis would be. And of the 4 that had elevated scores on the 3 measures, 1 child had a clinical best estimate of ASD, the others were ADHD, learning difficulties, or social pragmatic communication disorder. So I won't labour our ASD sample, except to say that 9 of the 14 kids who participated in the study had elevated rates on all 3, and then 8 of the 9 generated a clinical best estimate of a ASD diagnosis. So then when we look at this ADOS assessment across the different items that it's measuring, we see similarities and differences on the areas of, so the first 3 items here are looking at communication, the next 3 items are reciprocal social interaction, and then these last 4 items are looking at the restricted and repetitive behaviours that are associated with ASD. So in the first 3, we see, well, overall you see lower endorsement of ASD symptoms in our 22q group, which is the purple group here. But then you also see some convergence, so low rates on this one, which is A9. Now I've lost my notes. It's the use of descriptive and informal gestures, so using gestural communication to convey information to the interviewer. And then in terms of reciprocal social interaction, we see differences emerge in the domains of eye contact and quality of social overtures, with our 22q group reporting lower impairment in these domains. And then we also see lower endorsement in our 22q group of these restricted and repetitive behaviours. But then here, we see some elevated difficulties, but still less than our ASD group in the domain of reciprocal social interaction. So then coming back to here and trying to tease apart these similarities and differences by measuring aspects of that sort of intermediate phenotype that might be contributing to these social difficulties that we're seeing. We looked at gestural communication. So I mentioned the intentions to communicate compared to incidental gestures. And what we see is really high performance, so 88% accuracy in both of our groups, identifying intentions to communicate. So differentiating whether someone's just doing sort of a random, hair tuck compared to waving hello or trying to tell you something. The next step with this is then coding our responses. So yes, they're trying to communicate something, but when we ask kids, well, what's your interpretation of what they're trying to tell you? That's the next step, so coding those responses. Next, we looked at effect recognition. So kids were asked to compare, to find from the faces down here, the one that matches the child at the top in terms of the facial effect that they're displaying. And again, we see no group differences between our 22q and ASD groups, and we also see performance typical of children their age on effect recognition. And in theory of mind, again, we see quite high performance on our measures of theory of mind from the NEPSI and no group differences. On expressive language, it gets a bit more complicated. So we see an interaction effect where both groups are performing within the average range, with average being around 100, but we see kids with 22q showing an advantage for receptive language, and kids with ASD showing an advantage for expressive language. So expressive language is generating a word for a picture, so one word to describe a concept or an action or an object. My conclusions, so I'm about to run out of time. So on the basis of our preliminary data, It would seem that parent report measures alone may not be an effective predictor of the presence of ASD symptomatology in 22q. I think that confirms what Tony and Kathy found the first time when they included ADOS measures as a measure of autism symptoms in 22q. We see similar performance on measures of social cognition and theory of mind, and we also see performance typical of children their own age at the group level on measures of affect recognition. And then we see some evidence of divergent patterns in language performance between our 22q and idiopathic autism groups. And so I'd like to say thank you to my mentors, as well as the clinicians here at the Mind who have been extremely helpful conducting some of the measures included in this study, and of course the 22q team and the kids and the families who participated in the study. We can't do this work without you, so I'm hugely grateful for you taking the time to come to the Mind.